Got it.
So welcome everyone to our special table talk. And I'll go ahead and put up the title slide. I think you all know why we're here. And this is how we've been showing it each Sunday recently, our congregation's history. As you see on the right-hand side, we are the church that named the town of Bethesda, as many of you know. And Bethesda is a healing pool in John's gospel. And in order to be about healing and you know, practicing what we preach, if you will, and to continue in the good graces of what Bethesda is all about, there's a lot of healing going on in the world right now about a racial reckoning. And we have much to be humble about and humbled about in our own church in terms of our background, our racial history of the church. Ron Grimm has done some amazing work. This is part 2 of a racial reckoning. If you have yet to see part 1, you can find that on our website at BethesdaPresbyterian.org. That's BethesdaPresbyterian.org. I'll put that in the chat a little bit later. And thank you for joining us. Ron is, as you can see, he is a Ph.D., a professional cartographer, over 40 years of experience cultivating 3 of the nation's most prestigious map collections, as you see there, the National Archives, the Library of Congress, and the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library, where he was a curator of maps. He recently retired, and we are very thankful he retired to Bethesda so that Ron can be part of our church community and part of the community as a whole. And he's really dug deep into the history of this community and of our church. And just to, let me stop the share here. Sorry about that. In 1820, our church took its name from the healing pool in John's gospel. In 1871, we bequeathed that name to our town 150 years ago today. By the way, if you're not on mute, if you can mute yourself, I would be grateful for that. With a nod to our healing origins, Ron takes his historical deep dive. He's unearthing some layers of racism upon which our church, like so many, has been nourished. So let the stories be told, and in the process, let the healing continue. And Ron writes that he is concerned, like so many of us, with the historical roots of our racial caste system in our country. And he says he's going to continue to unpack the journey tonight. And he will tell you more in a moment. But if we could all just have pause for a moment of prayer. Gracious God, we are reminded anytime we enter our pain simply to experience it in its rawness, it can pull us away from where we want to go. So let this be a redemptive experience tonight as we hear with new ears. We hear a story that's been seldom told. And that we can trust that if that memory ever causes us pain, that your redeeming force of the Spirit in this world will bring us forth safely to the other side. And that this may make us more of a transformative body in your world around us, in race, in diversity of all kinds. And for that opportunity, we give you thanks. Amen. So I'm going to turn it over to Ron now, and you can take it from here.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this evening's presentation. As I continue to look at the slaveholding practices and attitudes of Bethesda Presbyterian families before, during, and after the Civil War, considering our recent discussions on racial reconciliation, it seemed appropriate to me to investigate and reconstruct this history and try to determine what it means for our congregation more than 150 years later. As you're aware, as I have said in the past, Bethesda Presbyterian has a long history in this area. The congregation started in the 1720s, and since that time it has moved 3 times. It's been in 3 different locations, and it has witnessed a host of major themes in American history. The European colonization of the native lands of the Chesapeake, the Revolutionary War as our country gained its independence, the antebellum period when agriculture using slave labor was so predominant, the Civil War, which almost tore the country to 2 pieces, the Jim Crow era and segregation, World War II, or World War I and World War II, in which our area experienced extremely rapid growth. And then finally, suburbanization and currently urbanization. Tonight, my presentation will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will be just a quick review of what I talked about in April. Then I will look very deeply at one family's experience. And finally, we'll take a quick look at a few other families, at their experiences, and also what happened. One of the questions that I'm continuing to ask is what happened to the emancipated slaves following the Civil War. In between each one of these segments, we'll stop, and if you have questions, type them in the chat, and we can then we can focus on the questions for that particular topic. And then at the end, we'll have time for more questions, just trying to synthesize everything that we have heard. The 1850s and the 1860s are an interesting and intriguing period of history for our local area, primarily because Maryland was a border state. It was considered a slave state, but it did not secede from the Union. Because of that, there were divided loyalties within the local area. We see these in various county and state histories. I would like to, we will also try to see how representative the Bethesda Presbyterian Church is of these generalizations. Now I start with details from a map that I showed before. This is a map that was published in 1860, and it shows the percentage of slave population in each county in the southern states. I have just picked details here of the Virginia and Maryland area, and then also of the Washington, D.C., Montgomery, Prince George's County area. And you'll see at this point, Montgomery County had about a third of its population that was considered enslaved. Not quite as high as some of the Tidewater counties where tobacco cultivation was quite strong. It was starting to diminish as you move north and to the west. You get a sense here when you see West Virginia where there's a very low percentage of enslaved population, which prompted West Virginia to break away as a separate state. Now, just to remind you, one of the ways that I determined who were church members, I did not have a list of members at that particular time period. I had to go through church records, look at baptisms, funerals, confirmations to glean names. I went through several church histories that listed some of the major family names. I correlated them with this map, which is from 1865. It's the first map of Montgomery County to show the names of landowners. The blue circle here in the center is the location of the church. Each of the red circles represents a separate family that I have determined was a member of the congregation at least some of the time during the 1850s and the 1860s. And I think you'll see there are about 25 or 26 families. And here I have listed the names of those families. And the major question in that initial study was the number of enslaved people each one of those families held. And you can see the listing there. The left, this middle column shows the families that held none. The one on the right shows the families that did hold enslaved peoples and the number. Now, you'll see I have several names in red. Those are the families that I am going to talk about tonight, so that you get a sense of where they are in this particular divide. And the other thing that I've added, which I didn't have there before, are two asterisks. These particular families engaged in a practice of hiring enslaved people that were owned by other individuals. I didn't pick up on this in the first presentation, but I think this presents sort of a new twist to the enslaving practice. I think what we find is that some of the plantation owners no longer needed the enslaved people. They had to keep their farms productive. So they rented them out to other people, and that way they continued to make money on their investment. Okay. Now, this is a summary of what I've determined for the Bethesda Presbyterian families. There were 26 households or families. 11 had no enslaved people. 15 were slaveholders. 5 had one. 10 had more than one. That's a total of 115 enslaved people, and that works out to an average of about 7.6. Now, how does this compare to the county? I looked at the numbers for the entire county, and if I didn't miscount, I'm sure I did, I probably made some mistakes, it's quite a long list. There are at least 632 households in this portion of Montgomery County. This is what is called District 4 or the Rockville District. It would be like the southwestern quarter of the county. So in that district, there were 632 households, 197 with enslaved people, which means about 31% were slave holders. Now, I did break it down for Rockville and outside of Rockville. It's not a whole lot of difference. But I think the thing you will notice is that the percentage of enslavers within the congregation was almost twice as much as the county average. Now, the average number of enslaved people is about the same. Now, if we'll stop a moment, and if you have any questions regarding that first overview, I can address them at this point. Let's see. Chuck, do you see any questions in the chat?
Not currently, Ron.
Okay. Well, let me continue. And again, if you have questions that fall back on this first part of the talk, which I've sort of titled as names and numbers. Names of the white people who owned plantations and enslaved people, and the number of Black people or enslaved people that they utilized on their plantations. Now, part 2, I have subtitled Different Perspectives. And if you catch the imagery here, The picture in the first slide showed the front of the old meeting house, which is the way we normally picture the Bethesda meeting house, how it looked from the road as you're passing by. In this case, I walked up on the grounds and took a picture of the south-facing side. Now, that has there's some meaning to that, because the first family that we look at really represents a Southern perspective. Part of my thought as I was trying to advertise this was taking pictures of the windows and the doors and thinking, okay, we're going to look through the windows and we're going to look through the doors and get a better idea of what the congregation was like at that time in the middle of the 19th century. Now I'm going to look, okay, several questions that I want to try to address in this segment is to go beyond the names and the numbers. And I want to try to get a sense of what enslavement and secession meant to church members and to the people in the surrounding communities. Also, we'll get a sense of what's the military activity related to the Civil War, how it affected this area. And it was something that was prominent throughout the time period. And the final question that I want to try to look at is what happened to the enslaved people that our church members possessed following emancipation. Now, to begin with, we're going to look at one family, the Frederick L. Moore family. Interestingly, okay, I sort of ignored this family in the first presentation. They didn't turn up as being very prominent. I think I noticed that they had 2 enslaved people. I missed them in a few listings, but as I continued my reading, I found out that the wife, Virginia Moore, wrote a remembrance in the early 20th century. She gathered together her thoughts for her grandson, Fred, and the idea was to tell him what it was like to live in this area during the Civil War. The Moores came from Washington, D.C. They moved to the Bethesda area about 1859, primarily because the husband, Frederick, hey, I'm getting sort of on a familiar basis with them. It's Fred and Jenny to me, but I'll try to be a little more polite and refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. Moore. But anyway, Mr. Moore was not very well, and he was fairly young at that time. He was in his early 20s, and the doctors advised that he needed to move out of the city and find an area that would be more conducive to his health. Now, Virginia's roots were in DC. Her father and her grandfather were DC residents. Frederick Moore came from families, I think, that were in North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. So he had much stronger Southern roots. And some of his family advocated that he would move in those areas. But they made a decision to move to Bethesda. Okay, now, just how did I find Virginia's remembrance? I was reading Bill Offutt's Bethesda Social History. Bill used a lot of Virginia's notes to write his Civil War chapter. So that was my key to finding her narrative. And it came out as I read it that she was a member of the Bethesda Presbyterian Church. The full report, her full remembrance, was published in 1984 in the Journal of the Montgomery County Historical Society. So I could see it in full as well as excerpts that Bill Offutt used. Okay. Okay, now, first of all, Mrs. Moore explains why they moved to Bethesda. And she starts out saying, my father offered to give us any plantation we would select if we would settle at some not distant place from Washington. The doctors, too, preferred this to a more enervating climate. So we fixed upon this pretty place 7 miles out in Bethesda neighborhood, near the church in Maryland, which you know as Wildwood. I think that's the first time I've heard our church referred to as Wildwood, but I think that is the reference there. This plantation was situated on the main turnpike road from Washington and Georgetown, that's the Rockville Pike, up through the state, and just at the upper end of our place, the county road came in. This road passing from the turnpike across to the Potomac Road. That is Cedar Lane, the road that we know as Cedar Lane today. And then she makes a general comment about this situation at this time. Remember, she's writing to her grandson at this point. As history has told you, as soon as war was declared, Maryland, naturally a southern state, was overwhelmed with federal troops to hold her down and compel the continuance in the Union, thus making the Potomac the dividing line between North and South. What have I done wrong? Okay. I guess I have a slow connection here. So I've taken some pictures of the current location of their farm. It's on the southwest corner of the intersection of Rockville Pike. This is Rockville Pike looking south and Cedar Lane coming across. It is currently the site of the National Institutes of Health. There's nothing that remains of their house. I think it was replaced in the early 20th century by another house, and that house may still be on the grounds of NIH, but it's a gated community, which I can't enter. But there was a stream that was right at the corner of the property. So that's one of the few pieces of evidence of that original location where they were. I apologize. I'm not sure what's happening. The slides are not advancing.
Ron, you might find something at the bottom of the screen, the arrows, that's an alternative way to advance. I don't know if that works for yours.
I'm not seeing that. Okay. Well, Virginia takes a little time to describe the place, and I think that I'd like to share these with you. About a year and a half before these events, that's meaning the beginning of the Civil War, we had bought our plantation in Maryland, a small one, less than 100 acres, for we were new to country life, and were pleasantly established there with our 3 baby girls, Ella, Julia, and Eloise, who died 4 months later. Now, interestingly, that is documented in the church records. There is a date, a note for Eloise's baptism, and then the next day for her funeral. Sad moment. Our house stood on a high hill in a beautiful grove, back of which was a fine pine grove, which was particularly adapted to our needs, as lung trouble was then feared to be grandfather, and this means Mr. Moore. Remember, she's writing to her grandson at this point. The hill on which our house stood was about a quarter of a mile from the main road, the turnpike over which troops constantly passed, and was approached by two long winding roads from two gates, one at the lower end, one at the upper, close to the county road of which I have spoken, which leads to the Potomac River. The house commanded full view of the road so that when troops passed, sometimes in disorderly fashion, well, we knew it. Okay, I included this map to show you the general location of their farm in relationship to Washington, D.C., and the military defenses around the city. See these blue markings? These are fortifications that were built to protect the city during the Civil War. And this detail shows the Rockville Pike, Old Georgetown Road, and then right up here at the top, see this little square, this little dot? That's their farm, and those are the two lanes that she's talking about coming into their property. Okay, just to refresh your memory about the makeup of their household according to the 1860 census. Here we see Frederick Moore as the head of household, 25 years old, farmer, Virginia the wife, 2 children. Then we see there is a servant named Sarah Green, 24 years old, and a mulatto. That's the description that they're giving her. Then there is Albert Green, 3 years old. Remember these 2 names because we'll come back to them, Sarah and Albert. And listed below them is another family, which you might think has no relationship. The name is Thomas Carroll, and you see farm manager. We later learn that he is the overseer of their plantation, and his family's listed. And as we look at the slave record, the slave census schedule for 1860, we see his name down here, and we see that there are 2 individuals listed. A Black female, 40 years old, and a Black male, 19. This is what I didn't pick up before. It says F.L. Moore employ. So he's employing these 2 individuals who were owned by a Miss Potter. Now, considering their location, they were a witness to much of what was happening in relation to the Civil War around Washington, D.C. And this is the reaction to the first battle in the Washington, D.C. area, the Battle of Bull Run. One day in July, 1861, grandfather, driving home from the city in his buggy, found the road blocked by hundreds of disorganized soldiers, Federals in full retreat after the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, where they had been badly beaten by the Confederates. And those not taken prisoners were escaping into Maryland, worn, bloody, dirty, and hungry, clamoring for food and water. In a few hours, every spring and well in Tenleytown, where was a toll gate on the pike, was drunk and dry, and all available food consumed. And she goes on to say, I shall never forget the excitement of the days on which that dreadful battle was fought. On Sunday particularly. The firing was terrific, and we sat with clasped hands and anxious thoughts in hearts, almost starting from our seats as the roar of the cannon reverberated over the hills, telling of the carnage, the suffering, just across the river. A hush seemed to fall upon all. Even the children and servants paused to listen, wide-eyed and awe-stricken. And to give you a geographical sense, Here's a map showing the location of the Battle of Manassas or Bull Run in relationship to Arlington and Washington, D.C. And where I have the circle drawn up here, G and O, this is where their farm was located. So just imagine them sitting on their front porch, hearing the cannons and the shooting that is taking place over 10 miles away. It must have been a traumatic event to be listening at that point. Now she continues to describe that day, and it's important because in this description, she tells us about one of their neighbors. Seated on the porch with us was our dear old friend, Judge Robert Dunlap, who lived alone, a bachelor in the colonial home of his ancestors at about a mile from us. Every Sunday he spent with us, returning to us after the morning services in the little church just across the road from us, the Bethesda Meeting House. He was a Democrat in politics and strongly Southern in his affiliations, as were many others, opposed to secession, feeling that it would have been wiser for the South to fight for its rights in the Union. While we, believing this to be hopeless, felt that since we could not live peaceably together, we had no alternative but secession. Therefore, we had agreed not to talk about the war. So whenever he appeared, often 2 or 3 times a week, we and he put on our muzzles, and so our friendship remained unbroken till the day of his death. Well, this dear friend, as I have said, sat on our porch during that battle, neither of us daring to say what was in our mind. At first, we tried to make conversation, but finally fell into silence, each respecting the feelings of the other, too much to express the bitterness within. Perhaps the self-restraint was good for us, but it was hard work to keep still. And for the first and only time, we were glad when supper was over and he rode home. So here you see 2 neighbors going to the same church, and they have political differences on what was the best solution to the nation's problems at that time. And to give you a sense of how divided the nation was in 1860, I have a map showing the election results from 1860. Notice blue is for Lincoln, representing the Republican Party. And one of the issues that the Republicans were advocating is that slavery would not be extended into the new territories. Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, the Northern Democrat, believed in what he called popular sovereignty, meaning that the people of a local area should decide if slavery is introduced or not. Breckinridge, the Democrat, basically believed that slavery should be made available in all of the new territories. And then finally, Bell, with the Constitutional Union Party, from what I've read, is they didn't say a whole lot about slavery, but tried to work on solutions and would have tried to work on compromises and solutions that kept the Union together and worked within the Constitution. Now here are the results for the Maryland election, and you can see how divided it was. Breckinridge had the leading vote. Bell was second. Douglas and Lincoln came in a far distant third and fourth. And if you look at here, you'll see how it's divided between the pink and the green. And if Gene Dudak's there, look at York County. We are divided between the yellow and the pink. I think that's representing a vote for Buchanan or his advocate. Okay, now just to remind you a little bit about Dunlap. Okay, Dunlap lived over here about a mile away from Moore in the Presbyterian Church. You go down the Rockville Pike and go over Jones Bridge Road to Robert Moore's plantation. And at the last time, I indicated to you that he was a farmer and judge, age 65, bachelor, no wife or children listed, and he held 15 enslaved persons. He seemed to be fairly active in the church. He's recorded in various records. His house still stands. It's part of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. I couldn't get beyond the gate. There you can get a sense of what the house looks like. And here are his records from the 1860 census. His single listing, and then here his listing of the enslaved people that he owned. Okay, now one of the big concerns for the family during this time was the fact that the Union Army troops were stationed here in Montgomery County along Rockville Pike, sort of guarding the entrance to Washington, D.C. and helping to defend it. And so there was a constant presence of Union troops in the area. And here are some of the reactions. One morning, however, we wake to find an armed man standing at each of the many trees encircling the house. Grandfather asked why they were there and was told their officers were approaching and would tell him. Just at that moment, our magnificent Newfoundland dog, the protector and companion of our people in their daily walks, dashed, barking loudly up the hill. A shot rang out, and he lay at the door, howling and bleeding before our eyes. As to grandfather and myself on that sad morning, we nervously waded through the tragedy to see what was to come when the officers appeared. I was possessed with the idea that they had come to take him, Mr. Moore, my husband, to the old Capitol prison, as had been done to other Southern men, although no charges had been brought against him. So I packed his valise. We each took a dose of nerve tonic, Hoffman's anodyne, and you can Google that and you will find out exactly what it is with pictures. And then tried to eat our breakfast so that he would not go off hungry at least. In about an hour, 3 officers appeared, crossing the field between us and our nearest neighbor and friend, the Reverend Mr. Cumston. This is part of the reason I've told this story, is so that we could introduce the pastor of Bethesda Presbyterian, upon whom they also had been making an early morning call. Finding they had not arrested him, a Virginian holding our own sentiments, we took courage and calmly waited. So we see that there are political affiliations between the Moores and the Cumstons. Now, what was this reference to the old Capitol prison? And the thing that is interesting to me is she mentions the old Capitol prison various times in her narrative. It was a building located just near the Capitol building. It was constructed by a group of men that included her grandfather, Henry Ingle. Henry Ingle was one of the first residents on Capitol Hill. Oops. He had bought some lots on New Jersey Avenue and he built his house here. And at the close of the War of 1812, when the British had burned the Capitol, he and several other men went together and built this building, which was the temporary home for Congress while the Capitol was being rebuilt. The building survived, and during the Civil War, it became a prison for Confederate sympathizers. So the prison was in her mind because it had a family association, but it was also in her mind because it was feared that that's where they could end up if their true sympathies were pronounced too loudly. Now, just to look a little bit closer at Reverend Cumston, we'll see that he lived in the parsonage right next to the church. So it's a really close little neighborhood right here. Now, she indicated that Compton was a Virginian. Well, he was born in New York, but he did several pastorates in Virginia, and his wife and son were from Virginia. So I think in sympathies, he was a Virginian. He was the pastor of the church from 1859 to 1874, and he's the individual who was credited with advocating the name of Bethesda for the local post office. So as we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the naming of the town, it's Mr. Compton that we can thank for that, at least that nudge for acceptance. Now, according to the 1860 census, we see that his household consisted of himself, his wife, a son, 11 years old, and one servant, a white female. But, okay, there's the parsonage too. It's right next to the church. It was built in 1850, about the same time as the current structure was built. And in the slave schedules, we find that he also possessed 2 enslaved people. And what I missed before was this little word here, EMP. He employed these enslaved people who were owned by J.D. Thomas. One was a male 24, and another a female 16 years of age. So this is the backside of the parsonage. Now, see, I hope I'm obviously spending a lot of time on the Moors, but let me just do one more thing here, because she does make mention of the people that they hired and that they had enslaved. So we can just get a little bit of sense of what their meaning was to their livelihood. She mentions the overseer, Mr. Carroll, the cook, Nancy, field hands, and one special person with the name Mammy. Now, there were several days preceding the Battle of Antietam. The Union Army was marching north through Montgomery County. And as the Army went north, they demanded food, and they helped themselves to family dinners. And after they had passed through, they determined that they had very much little food left, and they didn't have enough medicine for their baby who was relatively sick. So they decided they needed to go into Washington, D.C. To get more medicine and more supplies. But the question was, who would go? If Mr. Moore went, that would leave Mrs. Moore and the servants and the children all alone by themselves. So they sent Mr. Carroll, the overseer, a respectable white man who lived in their tenant house. So this verifies the relationship of the Carrolls to the Moores. And so he accompanied her into the city, and they had quite a little trip there trying to prove who they were, and they had the proper passes. But we won't get into that. It's just that I want to show that Mr. Carroll was the overseer. Then there's mention of the cook, Nancy. And there were various times when Union troops came to the house demanding food. And so it fell on the responsibility of the cook to bring out the food. So we have 2 examples here where where she is mentioned. Then the hired hands. Now this is a little confusing to me, as if you look through these examples, the hired hands and the men are in plural. In the slave schedule, there was only one man. So either they were employing, I guess the possibility is that they hired other people after the 1860 census, because now we're talking about 1862 and 63. I will read this center quote right here, because I think it has some interesting thoughts about at least the Northerners' thoughts about slavery. When our Negro men came in from the field, one Union soldier remarked to his companion, "Jim, what the devil did we do to come down here for anyhow?" This is the Northern troops sort of questioning why they were even in this war. "These Negroes don't want to be free. They don't even want to fight for themselves. They are better off than we are today. Plenty to eat, plenty of tobacco, and more time to loaf than we ever had. I don't know what we came here for." The third example, a white man came up to them when they were in the field, and they later determined that this man was a Northern spy. But there were just these mentions, not much more about them than that. But Mammy, we can now, from these particular excerpts, we get a sense of the role of Mammy in the family and taking care of the children. When the Confederates marched through the area in 1864, there was a lot of military action outside their farm. And they went out to watch. And soon all were watching, except the children who were too young, except the children who were young enough for Mammy to hold on to. She was their protector. And then there was a news report that some Union troops charged some retreating Confederate troops. And Mrs. Moore remarks, but we who were there, meaning the people who lived in the area, were only amused when the newspapers referred to Duffy's Creek, because it was a tiny stream running across the pike, over which our little children often stepped from stone to stone when out with Mammy. She was their caregiver. And then another instance, when they were visiting a neighboring family on their way back, they were stopped by a Union officer who happened to be a German and really didn't know a whole lot of English. So the comment is, after much argument through translation by one of the men, and the discovery that there were 4 small children in the party, for your father was the baby asleep in Mammy's lap, we were conducted to our gate and allowed to go home. So these are just 3 examples of the care that Mammy provided for the children. But there's a much larger story, which we learn. And she starts off saying, "What should we have done in those days without our dear, faithful Mammy to aid us in the care of our helpless little ones?" She too was carrying her heartache. Her husband, from a nearby plantation, when having a day's holiday in Washington, was accosted on a street by a white man from the North, and then invited into a saloon where he soon got him under influence of liquor. And when some hours later, poor Wesley came to himself, he was in uniform as a regularly enlisted recruit in the Federal Army. And I understand this happened quite frequently with, as the Northern Northern Army tried to enlist some of the enslaved people in the Northern Army. Wesley, the husband, was heartbroken and begged to be released, but all to no avail. He was allowed to communicate with his wife, so grandfather took Mammy to the camp just across the Potomac to see him. Every effort was made to secure his release, but all failed. He was killed in his first battle at Petersburg, June 19, 1864. After the war, grandfather secured a pension for Mammy, and this helped in building the home on the lot just back of 1680 31st Street, Washington, which we gave her. That address confused me for a bit, but I eventually found out that in 1871, the Moores left Bethesda, moved to Georgetown, and that is the address where they lived in DC. And the gist of the story here is they built a house for Mammy to be part of their household. Oh boy. Okay. Okay. If you're quick, I'll try to summarize these because I am getting a little long here. But Mrs. Moore, reflecting on the emancipation of the enslaved people, basically reflected that many of the enslaved people, or she felt many of the enslaved people, were not ready for freedom. They hadn't been trained, or they hadn't been educated in what it meant to be self-supporting. And so in these particular quotes, you'll see that she reflects on some of those thoughts. But she feels that some of the families, some of the enslaved folks who stayed with the families that had originally enslaved them, turned out to be some of the better Negroes that are now in this, that were then in the South. So we see sort of a very sort of negative or biased opinion here. Okay, at this point, if we might want to stop and take a few questions, because this is the end of the comments from Mrs. Moore. Okay.
If anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. And since I'm unmuted, I just want to remark quickly about that dinner, the time gathered with Judge Dunlap, and that awkwardness about talking about issues, making people into issues, and how that resonates with many people, many of us here today who may go to a faith community, and how we look back on that and we say, when we know that enslavement was bad, it's terrible, but at the time it was much more, how can we keep the peace among our own? And would we have been the same way at that time? I found that a remarkable conversation that she was relating there.
I mean, to me, you could really feel the tension in the conversation that she relates there.
Mm-hmm.
Ron, thinking back on the retreating soldiers from the Battle of Bull Run, I'm just curious. I don't know if you know how they got across the river. Was there some sort of bridge? It had to be more than 10 miles because they would have had to go some river crossing, right?
You're exactly right. I don't know how they crossed the bridge or crossed the river. There were one or two bridges, but I'm not quite sure when they were constructed. So there may have been ferries or boats that took them across.
I just couldn't help wondering. They had to have been retreating for days and days, I guess.
I do remember a little bit about the Battle of Ball's Bluff, which took place in Loudoun County. And I remember that the northern troops were ferried across the river for that particular battle. So I would assume that that was part of the way of crossing.
It would be interesting to know how the ethic of inviting somebody to dinner with whom you disagreed every Sunday, and he came over a couple other times during the week, how that was formed. We just flee from it. You know, we give up. We can't talk to these people. You know, I can't stand this any longer. And there must have been a very strong social construct that made it an obligation to not just have them over, but be nice and not fight.
Okay, well, consider he was a judge, so I think he was a fairly politically influential person in the community. They also came from, I think, a fairly influential family in Washington, D.C. So I think it was probably, I mean, part of the connection was, well, okay, I think somebody in one of my previous presentation said the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians were sort of your better sort of people. And so I think this is probably part of the socialization.
A class loyalty.
Yes. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking of Mr. Dunlap as a bachelor. Did he sort of self-invite himself so he had some people to really talk to and keep him company after church? It sounds like, I mean, it became a habit apparently. So
yeah, I just think that there was a social pressure to accommodate that, and it would have to be pretty strong because it sounds like her feelings about it were very strong.
Yes, yes.
Just interesting to see that go on.
I think it's also interesting that the disagreement was not North versus South. No, they were both Southerners, and they are both pro-slavery.
Exactly. And I'm not quite sure how the Southern Democrat versus the Constitutional Union differences play in there, but I think that's part of what was taking place. Okay, if no further comments, I will proceed. We dropped off, we just finished Mrs. Moore's commentary with her comments on emancipation. And I wanted to point out to you that emancipation was a process. It was not something that happened on one day. The date she was referring to was January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was read. That document pertained just to the enslaved folks who were within the colonies that were in rebellion, within the Confederacy. It did not pertain to the District of Columbia. It did not pertain to Maryland and the other border states. But you will see that the enslaved people in the District of Columbia were emancipated by an legislation in 1862 with the idea there would be compensation to the owners. Okay, then there's the Emancipation Proclamation. And as I said, Maryland was not included in that. The Maryland legislature did not pass a law until November 1864 that approved the emancipation of enslaved people. And then that was by a very slim margin. And then it wasn't until January of 1865 that the Congress passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and it wasn't ratified until 1865. So thinking that there was one day that emancipation took place is not true. It was a process. It took a while. Now, I had hoped that I would be able to find some information about what happened to the enslaved people who were that were owned by our members, what happened to them after emancipation. I was not very successful. There is a document that's called the Slave Census of 1867-68 from Montgomery County, Maryland. The original records are at the Hall of Records in Annapolis. The transcript is available at the County Historical Society. When I started to look at it, the librarian warned me. She said, it's not complete. And I went through it, and would you believe, not one of the Bethesda church members were listed in there. So I have no idea. They were not included in that census. Question is, did they not want, okay, part of the reason the list was compiled was people thought they might get some compensation from the government for freeing their enslaved people. I mean, one of the questions is, did they not file petitions? Did they not want the compensation? I don't think that's the answer. I just don't have the answer. The other document I looked at is an abridgment of petitions that were filed in the District of Columbia pursuant to that act of 1862 that freed the enslaved people in DC. Now, some of the people in Maryland had hired out their enslaved people to individuals in District of Columbia. And since those enslaved people were in the district at that particular time, they became free. And so the owners in Maryland could claim compensation. 3 or 4 of our church members made some claims, but none of the families that we're talking about. So I really sort of hit a dead end with that question. But what I did look at was the 1870 census for the families I've been talking about. First of all, there's nothing further on Mr. Dunlap because he passed away in 1869, and so he would not be in the census. Okay, now we can see the Moores. Here's what the 1870 census tells us about the Moore family. Frederick, the father, he is now listed as an agricultural implement dealer as opposed to a farmer. So it looks like he's accumulating some wealth. Virginia, the wife, the mother, 4 children, Mary, Julia, Lawrence, and William. William's the youngest, and he was the father of Fred, to whom Virginia was writing the remembrance. Then there's a Virginia Briggs, and she's listed as teaching school. So apparently they were, I would say, providing board, a room and board for the local school teacher. Then there are 2 servants. Okay, these are free servants. They're both Black. Eliza Stewart, Martha Nash. I don't know if there's any relationship of these 2 individuals back to the 1860 census or not. But what's more intriguing is the next listing of people. You might think it was a separate family, but it says it's a farm laborer and keeping house. The name, the head of the household is Henderson Reeder. That's a new name, but what is intriguing is the mother, or the wife, is Sarah, and she's 33 years old, and there's Albert, and he's 12 years old. This is the age difference of the Sarah Green and Albert Green that we saw in the 1860 census, and that were servants. They were not enslaved people. So my question is, I can't prove it, but is this Mammy? Is this Mammy's family? Did she remarry after her first husband passed away in the war? So that's, I don't know. That's my conclusion. Or not my conclusion, my hypothesis. Now, the Cumston family. Cumston is still listed as a minister. There's his wife, keeping house, and they have 1 servant, Black. Then there is, in essence, another household, but to me, it seems like they're attached to the Cumston household because the very last person who listed is Edward Cumston Jr., the son. He's now 21 rather than 11, and he's a clerk in the store. And living with him are 3 Black servants. So I don't know, where'd they come from? Were these some of the neighbors that they've hired now as servants? I don't know. But I must say, one of the intriguing things to me personally is that the family name for 2 of these people is Hyson. And that is the name of, that's my mother's maiden name. Now, she grew up in Pennsylvania, just north of the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, is there any connection? I don't know, but I'm curious, I'm intrigued. Okay, now we'll get to this other family in a minute, but that is the extent of the Cumston family. So in a sense, there are more Blacks within that family as servants than there were in 1860. And so again, I'm not sure I can make the correlation between who they had enslaved initially and who they have now. Okay, now I want to look at the people who lived across the street from the church. Now, these two families were not mentioned in Virginia Moore's narrative, but we did hear about them in my last presentation, particularly Samuel Perry. Samuel Perry was a church member, and during one of the Confederate raids down through Montgomery County, he went out and confronted the Confederate officers, and he was said to be a strong Union man. And again, I'm not quite sure that meant he was a Northern supporter. I think it may have been more in the context of the Constitution Union Party. But anyway, the officers laughed at him and they marched him up the street to Rockville and really sort of made fun of him for confronting them as Confederates. The other thing that's interesting about this family, if you Google slave quarters, Montgomery County, you come up with this picture. It's one of the few pictures that will come up in the Google search. The Google search tells you that this is slave quarters that were on the property of Louis Boerher, which eventually became the property of the Walter Reed Medical Institute. This structure was documented in the 1930s as part of the Historic American Building Survey, and then it was torn down.
Oh.
So, I think there is a connection between this particular structure and the Perrys and the Boers. And let's take a look. In 1860, here's Louis Boer. He has a small family and he's not listed anywhere in this, the slave schedules. But we do know that his wife, Margaret, was the daughter of Samuel Perry and that they were married in the Bethesda Presbyterian Church. We also see Samuel Perry here, and there are two of his older children living with him. His wife had died several years earlier. We also know that Samuel Perry owned 22 enslaved people in 1860. Now, the thing that I find intriguing is this little number 2 right down here. That column indicates the number of slave houses that were on that particular plantation. So there were 2. I would hypothesize that the slave house we just saw was one of the slave houses originally owned by Samuel Perry, because there's no indication that the Boers ever owned any enslaved people.
Ron, would it be safe to say that the enslaved did not have names? They were not listed according to their names in the census, but the servants were.
Exactly, yes. In 1860, enslaved people had no name, only the servants. And so that's why it's even more difficult to determine what has happened in 1870, because you're starting to see names that may have been around, but you don't know for sure.
Or the servants could be enslaved, but they had a higher standing.
Yes.
They could be considered enslaved, right?
Yeah. Okay, now here's the Boer household in 1870. There are no Black servants indicated. And what you'll notice is Samuel Perry is living with them, 69 years old. So I'm a little curious what happened to Samuel. I think he's probably now under the care of his family. Now, okay, let's see. Okay, I'll try to move a little more quickly here. I want to bring in one other viewpoint, and this is related to the Isaac Riley plantation. The Riley plantation is located a little bit north of the area where Bethesda Presbyterian congregants were living. Here's the church. Here are some of the northern members. And just a little further north, where the old Georgetown Road meets Rockville Pike, is the Riley plantation. Now, what's interesting here is that the Rileys were the people who had enslaved Josiah Henson. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about Josiah Henson in case you're not familiar. But what I want you to keep in mind as I tell you this, I find no evidence that the Rileys were members of Bethesda Presbyterian Church. And what is transpiring here occurred in the 1820s and the 1830s. It's a little bit before the time period that I have been focusing on. Okay, currently, Josiah Henson is remembered with a museum and park, which incorporates the Isaac Riley homestead. This is the Riley homestead, and to the side, you'll see a log structure, which was the kitchen and the quarters for the cook or any of the house help. This is what the current site looks like. This is the original house. This is now a museum, and behind is where the other slave quarters and fields would have been located. The importance of Josiah Henson is that he was enslaved up until 1830. He then escaped and went to Canada, basically following the Underground Railroad. When he was in Canada, he founded a settlement for fugitive slaves. He learned to read and write. He became a minister. He wrote an autobiography of his life, and some of which you'll hear in a few excerpts from. He published that in 1849. During this time period, he also went back into Kentucky and some of the border states and helped other enslaved people to escape to freedom. So he became quite a reputation of and importance in the fugitive slave movement. In this interval between 1849 and 52, he became acquainted with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it's said that the inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin was Josiah Henson. In 1858, the second edition of Josiah Henson's autobiography was written. After the war, I think he helped encourage some Black troops who joined the Northern forces, but he continued to live in Canada, and he never returned. He didn't return to live in the United States. Now, what I would like to do is just read a few excerpts from his autobiography, particularly which describe his early life and his time during enslavement. When he was born, his father was owned by one master whose name was Newman, and his mother was owned by another whose name was Dr. McPherson. The father had just been sold south to Alabama, as I recall, which means the prospects for his future life were not very great. But this is where we pick up the story. After the sale of my father by Newman, Dr. McPherson would no longer hire out my mother to him. He was far kinder to his slaves than the planters generally were, never suffering them to be struck by anyone. No degree of arbitrary power could ever lead him to cruelty. As the first Negro child ever born to him, I was his especial pet. He gave me his own Christian name, Josiah. And with that, he also gave me my last name, Henson, after an uncle of his who was an officer in the Revolutionary War. A bright spot in my childhood was my residence with him, bright, but alas, fleeting. For 2 or 3 years, my mother and her young family of 6 children had resided on this estate, and we had been in the main very happy. She was a good mother to us, a woman of deep piety, anxious above all things to touch our hearts with a sense of religion. How or where she acquired her knowledge of God, or her acquaintance with the Lord's Prayer, which she so frequently taught us to repeat, I am unable to say. Then he recounts that Mr. McPherson had an untimely death. He was coming back from a party where he apparently had been drinking too much. He fell off his horse and he passed away. And the story resumes. Our term of happy union as one family was now at last at end. Mournful as was the doctor's death to his friends, it was a far greater calamity to us. The estate and the slaves must be sold and the proceeds divided among the heirs. We were but property, not a mother and the children God had given her. Then the slave auction. Common as are slave auctions in the southern states, still the full misery of the event is never understood till the actual experience comes. The first sad announcement that the sale is to be, the knowledge that all ties of the past are sundered, the frantic terror at the idea of being sent down south, the almost certainty that one member of family will be torn from another, the agony at parting, often forever, ever, with husband, wife, child. These must be seen and felt to be fully understood. Oh, I forgot to mention the McPherson estate was in Charles County near Port Tobacco. The remembrance of the breaking up of McPherson's estate is photographed in the minutest features in my mind. The crowd collected around the stand, the huddling group of Negroes, the examination of muscle, teeth, the exhibition of agility, the look of the auctioneer, the agony of my mother. I can shut my eyes and see them all. Okay, my brothers and sisters were bid off first, and one by one, while my mother, paralyzed by grief, held me by the hand. Her turn came, and she was bought by Isaac Riley of Montgomery County. Then I was offered to the assembled purchasers. I must have been between 5 and 6 years old. I was bought by a stranger named Rob, and truly a robber he was to me. He took me to his home about 40 miles distance, which was Rockville, and put me into his Negro quarters with about 40 others of all ages, colors, and conditions, all strangers to me. Of course, nobody cared for me. The slaves were brutalized by this degradation and had no sympathy for me. I soon fell sick and lay for some days almost dead on the ground. Finally, I became so feeble that I could not move. This, however, was fortunate for me, for in the course of a few weeks, Rob met Riley, they wouldn't have been that far apart, who had bought my mother and offered to sell me to him cheap. They clenched a bargain and I was soon sent to mother. A blessed change it was. Now I was once more with my best friend on earth and her care. Destitute as she was of the proper means of nursing me, I recovered my health and grew to be an uncommonly vigorous boy and man. And finally, some comments on Mr. Riley. The character of Mr. Riley, the master who I faithfully served for many years, and it sounds like they developed a really good relationship in terms of Josiah respecting what the master wanted to have done. Okay, the character of Mr. Riley is by no means an uncommon one in any part of the world. Coarse and vulgar in his habits, unprincipled and cruel in his general deportment, and especially addicted to the vice of licentiousness. His slaves had little opportunity for relaxation from wearying labor, were supplied with scantiest means of sustaining their toil by necessary food, and had no security of personal rights. The natural tendency of slavery is to convert the master into a tyrant, and the slave into the cringing, treacherous, false, and thieving victim of tyranny. Riley and his slaves were no exception to the general rule, but might be cited as apt illustration of the nature of the relationship. And that is the reason I have included this part of this story in this presentation, because this is probably representative of other people who were living in the area. Now, in my presentation, we have seen two different perspectives on enslavement. One from the wife of a relatively small and new plantation owning family with apparently benign and gentle treatment of their enslaved and hired help. The other from an enslaved person who experienced the atrocities of enslavement, but was able to escape to freedom in Canada. What is the truth of these two different perspectives? Are they both valid? By making this presentation tonight, it was not my intention to condone or condemn the highlighted families. Rather, it was my purpose to present the available evidence to reconstruct congregants' personal history and what life was like during this mid-19th century time period. These findings should give us a better understanding and appreciation of our church members and the community's attitudes and practices regarding enslavement of African American people. During the 150 plus years, the demographics, economy, politics, and culture of this area have changed drastically. So has the Bethesda Presbyterian Church. As it has changed locations, it has directed its ministry to new and different audiences. Today, we are increasingly serving a more urban and diversified population. In the context of these changes, and as we reevaluate our mission, how can we apply the concept of healing associated with the name Bethesda as we determine our role in racial reckoning? Okay, questions, comments, reactions? One comment I would make, the autobiography by Josiah Henson was published by the same firm that published Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this all hit home to me because several years ago, I was studying a map of Kansas, published during the Bloody Kansas period, and it was published by the same publisher. It was the only map of Kansas published in Boston. And what I have realized is that the publisher of the map, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Josiah Henson's autobiography are by a publisher who was an anti-slavery publisher. So I don't really doubt the veracity of Josiah Henson's story, but as I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, I realized that it was sort of accentuating the negative to increase the favor of the anti-slavery movement.
Well, you read more of it than you told us, right?
Yes, yes.
All I saw was somebody trying to tell the reality, particularly as a child, and that must have been terrifying. Auction block thing, scene that he said.
Yeah, I just read one chapter, which I thought was probably the most crucial to his experience here in Maryland.
But you say again, you said you thought that it accentuated, it was like being political. Is that what you mean?
I think Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is supposedly based on his experience, is more, has exaggerated, maybe not exaggerated, but has accentuated some of the stereotypes that we hold for what it meant to be enslaved.
Well, Uncle Tom's Cabin takes him from, as I recall, Kentucky or the border area down into New Orleans where things were really bad.
Exactly.
So it's actually kind of interesting because it shows a variation in, you know, and you brought this out too, Ron. You know, the border areas that you know, encircled our church generally weren't giant plantations like they had down in the South.
Right.
So that it might have been kind of a different world.
I think the impression that comes to me is, yes, they were different worlds, but to me, the aspect of slavery that is probably universal and that is probably one of the hardest to understand is how families got separated. And there was not that much regard for keeping a mother and a father, a husband and a wife, and children together. That happened both in the border states and in the far southern states. Yes, plantations in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, I think, were much bigger. The labor was much harsher. The conditions were much more harsh. So yes, there are differences, but to me, the biggest hurt or the biggest problem was how families were broken apart.
It seems in the description from Mrs. Moore that even though that was a very small situation and she knew the names of the people who were on her property, you know, the enslaved persons, Mammy was the mammy to her children, to the owner's children.
Yep.
You know, like they recognized these enslaved persons only as cogs in the machine, only as they related to them. It really was even in that smaller situation, like I would think that if you only had 2 or 3 people in that position of being enslaved, that you would know them by name. Unlike when Henson was sent where there were 40 people and he didn't know any of them, nobody took care of him, he was a little kid. Those owners would not probably even know those people by name necessarily. But in that small situation, I always dreamed, at least, that it would be more humane, but it really was not at all.
Well, I think the one thing I would observe from the Virginia Moore accounts is that she really did not say that much about her relationships with the cook or the hired hands. We don't really know how they were treated. I mean, the only assumption is, okay, they might have been fairly well treated. We don't know. Or if we use the observation of the Northern soldiers who see that the enslaved people on her property seem to be well fed, maybe they were. Maybe that was a decent, reasonable observation.
Yeah, they said that the slaves had more than they had.
Yes.
But then they were soldiers deployed in a miserable, situation. It wasn't good.
And some of those soldiers came from factory backgrounds in the North. They were working in the textile mills or on the railroad or something like that, and maybe didn't have that good of conditions either.
Yeah.
I'm aware it's at 8:30, 8:31, and this is the time we agreed to close, but any other questions or comments to make? I don't want to shut anyone out from doing so.
How big was the congregation back then of the church?
There were two, okay, actually the Rockville Church and the Bethesda Church were on the same charge. And if I remember correctly, I think there were about 190 people when Compston left the area.
Mm-hmm.
So probably about 100 in each one.
And by the way, in 1926, when we moved to the present site, it was only about 90 members. So there's a lot that went on in that time frame. There was a lot of shuffling, and then the church took off in numbers as a urbanization came.
It was not a big congregation. I mean, 25 families, and not all of them would have been there at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been fascinating, Ron, and I'm sitting with a lot of the learnings from it, not just the history, of course, but how can we speak of and talk about the conditions of a people in a way that reduces the humanity and just the different layers of racism and all of this, and how we are doing some of that still today. And I noticed some of the themes that seem to continue today. Thank you so much. And it gives me a lot to think on and to reflect upon. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Once again, the recording of this will be on our website, and I'll put it at the websites, both the URL in the chat, BethesdaPresbyterian.org. We will continue at our church to look deeply in what it means to be the church that named Bethesda. How are we a church of healing today? And some of it can derive from some painful past, but also with Ron's great gifts as a cartographer and the deep research you've done. Thank you so much, Ron, for continuing to do that. And this will be to be continued.
We'll see.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Great presentation. Very thoughtful.
Everyone go in peace.
Peace, everyone.
I'll be the last one off because I'm the host here. So. Good to see you, Andy. Take care.